Greetings to each and every one of you. My name is Archbishop Durocher. I'm the Archbishop of Gatineau and the Apostolic Administrator of Mont-Laurier. Since the beginning of this coronavirus pandemic, I've been endeavoring every day to present the readings that the liturgy suggests for the celebration of the Eucharist and to give some commentary on them to see how they can help us in our prayer life and in our experience as we go through this difficult time. And right now I'm taping this little video as we approach the middle of the fourth week of Easter season. And the Gospel of John that we've been reading all along and that we're going to continue to read until Pentecost, the Gospel of John presents us with the final discourse of Jesus the night before he died. So after having washed the feet of his disciples, Jesus launches into this very long talk, which takes up actually 4 chapters. It's huge. It's very different from the other 3 Gospels because neither Mark nor Matthew give any sign at all of a talk, of a discourse by Jesus the night before he died. Luke has a short one, has a few words of Jesus, but nothing like John. And in order to understand this discourse and how we need to approach it, I thought it would be good to do this little introductory video to the discourse so that we could have an idea of how to approach it. And in doing this, I have to speak about the very nature of what Gospels are. We have 4 Gospels in our New Testament, and often when we approach the Gospels for the first time, we see them as kind of biographies, don't we? We think that basically somebody sat down and wrote down the story of Jesus. And in the same way that we can have various biographies of a famous person, putting an accent on this aspect or that, we can accept that each of the Gospels, highlights this story or that story. They can be quite different. John's is so different from the others, though, that it seems to be telling practically another story. We call the other 3 the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic comes from 2 Greek words meaning syn, which means together, and optos, which means to see, sight. So they see things in the same way. They see things together. They're synoptic. Whereas John's gospel has a different chronology, a different order, different vocabulary, different miracles that the others don't talk about. And that can lead us to ask the question, well, which one is right? Which one is closer to the truth? Did Jesus really say this? Did Jesus really do this? Now, I want to say that not just for John's Gospel, but for the 4 Gospels, these are not, we can't understand them as biographies. We have to understand them as texts of a believing community, helping their members to understand the truth of who Jesus was, of who Jesus is, because Jesus is risen, so he's still alive. Who is this resurrected Jesus? And so they are teaching documents. They are faith documents. Now, to help you understand this, I want to speak about a film that I saw, I think it was around the year 2000, called The Sixth Sense, with Bruce Willis. Maybe some of you have seen it, and you'll know what I'm talking about. And if the others haven't seen it, after I explain this, maybe you'll want to go see it. But the point of the story is Bruce Willis plays a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist in this movie. And at the beginning of a movie, he's the victim of a very violent crime. And afterwards, he receives a client who's this young boy, and this young boy is very, very troubled, and Bruce takes him to heart. The psychiatrist in the film takes him to heart and really tries to help him. At one point, the little boy kind of admits what his deep problem is that he says, "I see dead people." It's a very famous line from the movie, "I see dead people." But they don't know that they're dead, and so you can see that this child is quite traumatized, right? And so the story goes on, and but at the end, I won't go into the details of the story, but at the end, there's a revelation, something that happens that kind of throws everybody for a loop. It threw me for a loop, and everybody I've spoken to had the same experience. It forced us, that revelatory moment at the end of the movie forces us to say, I didn't understand the movie at all. I didn't understand what was going on at all. And to rethink the whole movie, to re-see each scene, to review it, to revise it. I don't know what's the right word, but you have to return to it with a new understanding that really helps you to see in a new way and to understand. Now, if somebody asked me, I won't tell you the story because I don't want to blow the punchline, but if somebody was to ask me, well, tell it to me anyway. Well, if I told the story, I wouldn't be able to tell it the way the movie goes and wait till the end to give you the punchline. I would tell it by kind of telling you what's really going on, wouldn't I? My new knowledge of the movie would be part of my telling of the story of the movie so that you could understand what's going on and not be in the dark like I was for the 2 hours of the movie lasts. Anyway, well, the Gospels are the same way. You see, because the apostles, they saw Jesus act, they heard Jesus speak, they related with Jesus, but they didn't really understand until after the resurrection. After the resurrection, then they realized who Jesus was. Then they went back and they revisited all his acts, his words, his very way of being with them and with the world. Their view, their vision was transformed. And so when they tell the story of Jesus, they don't tell it the way it happened, because then we'd be stuck in the same place as them. We wouldn't understand what's going on. No, they have to tell it with their new knowledge, with their faith in Jesus as the risen Lord and Savior of humanity. And so the Gospels, when they tell the story, they don't say it exactly how it happened. They say it, they relate it in a way that will understand the truth of what happened. You see, because the truth is not at the surface, the truth is in the depth, and they only understood the depth after the resurrection. I hope this makes a bit of sense to you. But it certainly, I think, indicates the way that the Gospels are not biographies. And each of the Gospel writers was writing from a very specific perspective, the perspective of his community, the context in which they were living, answering the questions that they were grappling with. And John's Gospel, it's clear that they came from a different tradition, you could say. They had another set of stories that were circulated, another set of teachings that were circulated, and they're not, how can I say, they're not any less true than the teachings and the acts that are in the other three Gospels, but they were integrated in a way that was particular to the community of John, and that explains the vocabulary of John's Gospel. It explains the order, it explains the vision, and it explains this final discourse, okay? Because one of the things that John does in his Gospel, you rarely see in John's Gospel, before this night, before he dies, you rarely see Jesus alone with his disciples, speaking just to his disciples. Most of the time, he's speaking to a crowd, or he's speaking to opponents, and he's facing antagonism. So it's always in a controversial setting. In the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, often we see Jesus speaking just to his disciples, and they're kind of taking it all in. So it's as if John held on to all the sayings of Jesus that he might have shared with his disciples, and he brings them all into that night before he dies. But for John's vision, Jesus' death is already the moment of his glory. He's already entering into his glory because his death is returning to the Father, going back to where he came from. And this return to the Father is already caught up in the glory. So the Jesus that we see speaking to their disciples the night before he died, you could say he's already the risen Jesus. He's already the risen Lord who is with the Father, who is in the presence of the Father, to the point where we could say that when we read these words, it's as if we can imagine the Jesus in the glory of the Father right now, here and now, speaking to us here in the 21st century. This is what we're hearing when we read the final discourse of Jesus. Now, this discourse, it's not, how can you say, written in, somebody didn't sit down and write it from A to Z, these 4 chapters. Actually, the chapters, most specialists today recognize that they're made up of different strata. You know, they were put together at different times. So I'm going to be following a specialist. His name is a Frenchman by the name of Xavier Léon Dufour. I'll be studying, following his proposal to read this. And he basically divides these 4 chapters into 4 parts. The first 3, Jesus is speaking to his apostles. The 4th part, and this everybody recognizes quite different, because the 4th part, Jesus is no longer speaking to his disciples, he's speaking to the Father. It's a prayer. The last chapter is a prayer. That's chapter 17, and we'll come to that prayer where Jesus kind of entrusts his disciples to the Father. He's praying for his disciples, and he's praying for us, as I was saying. But the other 3 chapters, 14, 15, and 16, basically, what we'll see here is that 14 kind of forms one unit, and in that unit, we see that Jesus will be speaking about the Holy Spirit here. As a matter of fact, throughout the discourse, he'll be speaking about the Spirit in a way that he hasn't spoken of the Spirit up to now in the Gospel. And he will show that the Spirit, in chapter 14, the Spirit is the Spirit that will teach and that will assist the disciples in understanding. In chapter 15, we see that there are echoes of a community that is in a situation of conflict. And so here the Spirit will be seen as more of a Spirit that gives courage, to testify in the face of rejection, in the face of disputation, you could say. So it's the Spirit that allows us to be strong and to remain, faithful. Whereas in chapter 16, and this might be the last, you could say, layer of this speech, and chapter 16, you'll see, takes up a lot of the topics that are in chapter 14, but they echo them in the context really of a major confrontation. And we can see here, unfortunately, evidence of the breaking away of the Christian community and the Jewish community, and the antagonism that was growing, the growing antagonism between the two, to the point where John's gospel at times is quite negative vis-a-vis the Jews, but particularly here in this last section vis-a-vis the whole world, and basically telling the apostles that, look, there are 2 ways in the world, and there's one way leads to darkness and to death. You have to stay on the way of light and of life. And so the Spirit helps us to confront the powers of darkness and to remain in the light. And that will be the 3rd part, you could say, of this discourse before we enter into that solemn and beautiful prayer. Obviously, the liturgy can only take little bits, every day. And I'm going to be presenting these little bits separately, one after another, trying to situate them within the broader context that I've just explained. But this whole discourse is a masterpiece of, you could say, just the world's religious literature. And it is truly a summit in the New Testament. And I think it's worthwhile sometimes when you have an hour to yourself and you've got quiet around you to just take up those chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17 and to read them through and to put yourself in the place of the disciples and to tell yourself that Jesus is speaking directly to you. The risen Lord is speaking to you right here, right now. And you will see the power and the beauty of this final discourse of Jesus. So together, let's take up that journey, and hopefully as we move forward, we'll be able to find the grace that is kind of hidden in these remarkable texts. God bless.